Welcome to Exultet Studios' first ever production. I'm your host, Ryan Johnson, here with my co-hosts and dear friends, Sal and Anthony Aquila. We are all undergraduate students at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. Our first series will be dedicated to discussing St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. For many people, it can be an intimidating text, yet understanding it is central to uncovering Aquinas' brilliant philosophical and theological insights. He is arguably the greatest philosopher to have ever lived. Now, I'd like to introduce our guest to the show. Please welcome Dr. Theodore Rebard. Dr. Rebard is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas. He earned his PhD in philosophy at Boston College and has taught at the university level for more than 40 years. Today, he will be providing us with a lecture titled An Introduction to St. Thomas Aquinas, Why the Modern Age Needs the Philosopher for All Ages. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Rebard. It is truly an honor and a privilege.
Thank you all very much for your invitation. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to help get us started on this. As Ryan indicated, a good title, or at least subtitle, for my introductory remarks is exactly to say that what I want to explain is some of why the greatest mind of the 13th century is so necessary for the 21st century. The 13th century, of course, is a long ways away. It was almost 50 years ago that we celebrated the 700th anniversary of the death of St. Thomas. It seems as though this is, as the old Star Wars gag goes, talking about something that happened long ago in a galaxy far away. Consider the interim of time. Before the Black Plague of the middle of the 14th century, recurrent twice during Shakespeare's lifetime and never quite put to end until after its last great upsurge in the 17th century, as recorded, for instance, in the history of the restoration of the monarchy in England and in Samuel Pepys' diary. This is a time during or since which there has intervened, with Francis Bacon and Descartes, the birth of modern philosophy in the mode of the moderns, something self-consciously rebellious against what is pre-modern. This is a time before the scientific revolution, before the rise of the nation state, before the Industrial Revolution, before the American, French, and Russian revolutions, before even the silly sexual revolution of the 1960s. This 13th century was the high tide, the great achievement of the Middle Ages. And sounding in the roar of this high tide is the voice of Thomas Aquinas, who, as his great teacher, St. Albert the Great, said, would roar with a voice that would be heard across the centuries, and which we try still to keep having before our minds today. This afternoon, what I hope to do is to introduce the symphonic thought of St. Thomas. St. Thomas's voice, always consonant, always harmonious, is at the same time enriched by the variety within it. The most conspicuous element of that, of course, is that Thomas raises a philosophical as well as a theological, a human and a divine wisdom. And I want to show in a beginning way that symphonic music needs to be heard and should impinge, and does in fact impinge, upon the 21st century. And that implies in turn that there needs to be an introduction to the 21st century. Oddly enough, for many of us living immersed in the 21st century, it, for that very reason, is difficult to see, is difficult to understand. So I'm going to start with a few remarks about what characterizes our times And that will generate, I hope, some observations that I will characterize as a diagnosis. Because if anyone, as so many people do, at present times are irrational in many ways, intellectually, socially, politically, technologically, and on and on and on, then I'm hoping that we can come to have some appreciation of a diagnosis of what is wrong. I want to try to come to the 21st century as though a visitor from outer space. Some references, first of all. I wouldn't want anyone to think that this is, that my remarks here about the 21st century are simply reflections or manifestations of my own criticisms and of my own native, sometimes anyway, pessimism. Well, some names. Viktor Frankl, the great psychiatrist, the great social observer, the father of logotherapy. Richard Weaver of the University of Chicago, the author of that exceedingly important mid-20th century book, Ideas Have Consequences. Neil Postman of NYU in the late 20th, early 21st century. More recently, a social observer who looks at a small piece of America but sees a great deal in it, J.D. Vance, the author of Hillbilly Elegy. Novelist Walker Percy, one of the great Southern writers in America of the 20th century, along with Flannery O'Connor. Sociologists Jean Twenge, Robert Nisbet, Shelley Turkle, novelist, philosopher, and psychiatrist. Also, I named twice Walker Percy. There are a lot of others, but I name simply these to give some further background and also to give some further references. If you wanted to look into any of the works by any of these writers, I think you would get a better taste of what's going, of what I'm trying to bring forward here. The summative observation that characterizes our time, what Jean Twenge, a sociologist, refers to as the iGen, the generation that has never known a world without the internet. And this is a generation of college students today, for the most part. To characterize this time, and a larger time extending back even into previous generations, X and Y and millennials and baby boomers. Okay. Postman's characterization is this: our time, quote, lacks any coherent, comprehensive, metaphysical, and religious way of thought. It lacks that. Immediately, I'd like you to notice that what we will be diagnosing here is a deficiency disease, scurvy or rickets. Our times suffer a deficiency disease, and the deficiency is what Postman said. And that was back in 1996, I think, in a book called Technopoly. Walker Percy says very much the same thing, all condensed into the title of one of his most important books, Lust in the Cosmos. Most people today, as Percy charmingly represents in that book, in which he, as a social pathologist, that's his own metaphor, as a social pathologist, puts Western culture such as it is on the couch and analyzes its psychiatric deficiencies. The late John Senior, one of the giants of the second half of the 20th century in classical education, identifies this deficiency as being a flight from reality, a flight from reality. Two examples will illustrate this. What Benedict XVI referred to as the dictatorship of relativism. If good and evil and true or false do not exist, then someone thinking that is at a distance from the real and is living in some kind of intellectual or imaginary artificial contrived, unreal world. The dictatorship of relativism precludes its own cure because it has in its doctrine an understanding that there is no such thing as the real to be known. Human minds, having denied what is, have no target, no goal, no aim, no natural object. They simply, at best, ramble. In the late Bernard Lonergan's rather engaging expression, there is no, if you are a relativist, there is nothing already out there now real to be known. From that condition, from within that pathology, there is no cure. And this begins to tell us why we need to look outside, and why we need not merely to look outside, but to look outside the whole modern world. Some particulars. I think there are probably many ways that you could divide this out, but I'm going to identify three different features of the world in which we live that identify it as in severe need of therapy. The denial of knowledge, the substitution for knowledge of mere opinion, always negotiable. Relativism is the universal solvent of all things human. It denies even the stability of the would-be self, knowing oneself. Against Socrates, the view of the relativist is the claim that it is impossible to examine life. Not merely that the unexamined life is not worth living, but that the examined life is impossible, and therefore it cannot be worth living, and it cannot be worth striving towards. A very recent book, just last fall, appeared by the editor of First Things Journal, Rusty Reno, and the book is called The Return of the Strong Gods. And in that book, he makes a very interesting point, and he makes the point charmingly because he so understates it. He says that in the world in which we live, and he's mainly talking about the cultural world post-Second World War, circumstances for people who want to think or need to think, people in politics, people in economics, people in the world of commerce, is very difficult because they are fearful of the truth. And he characterizes the condition in which someone lives who is fearful of the truth as being, quote, strained. And that's the most charming understatement I can imagine. It is difficult to live. It would be indeed difficult to live if you were afraid that there might be an abiding truth. Second, so relativism. Second, a decline in associational life. Associational life is very well characterized by the mid-20th century great sociologist Robert Nisbet, who identifies associative life, our social lives, in these ways. He says, well, first there's family. After all, we are born as sons and daughters, and most of us are born as brothers and sisters, as nieces, as nephews, and so on. We are born into a pre-existing social network. But the family is in decline. So family, neighborhood. The immediate association of the people around whom one lives. American society is very mobile. And where, just to cite one easy example, when I was a little kid, enough, I could walk to my grandparents' house, my great-grandparents' house, and it was a short drive to my other grandparents' house, or a bus or a streetcar ride, and we all saw one another very frequently. And the year I was born, no one had moved in 50 years. I was taken home to the same house that my grandfather built for my grandmother in 1903 when they were married. Neighborhoods don't work that way anymore. Neighborhoods don't work that way anymore. Church. Everybody knows that in all versions versions, church life is in decline. It's true of Protestants, it's true of Catholics, it's true of Jews. So the third element is in decline. Nisbet then identifies larger civic engagement, towns and cities, things of this sort, political associations, especially of a local kind. And these are not operative in the way that they have been in the past either. Patriotism is almost a virtue that is denied. It is a characteristic that is often scorned in our time. And finally, then Nisbet identifies professions. It's very, very common in generations, including my own, but especially after my own, that people will have 2 or 3 different professions, and even within a profession, they will work for several employers or several firms or in several different sorts of, several different jobs, rather than, and I always cite the example of my best friend's father, who graduated from the University of Texas Law School just after the Second World War and went to work for the firm from which, when he died, he was still working as the managing partner. And he had 2 uncles and a brother who also worked for the firm, which is still operative. But that was not an unusual thing at the time, but it is an unusual thing now. So professional loyalties. And then lastly, Nisbet talks about what he calls, it's a catch-all, associations of interest. This is anything from your poker club to a book club to a travel club to a service organization or something like this. And these also are in enormous decline. It's been very much commented that in the middle of the 20th century, television contributed to that people stayed home and looked at a television set rather than associating with their friends. But that's its own different story. So there's a decline in association, decline in associational life, and that's unhelpful because we are social by nature. And lastly, and I owe my acute consciousness of this question to the great physician, biochemist, social observer, classicist, you name it, Leon Kass from the University of Chicago. We are very good at efficiency. We are very good at making money. We are very good at organizing our activities. But in all of that, what we miss is even asking the question, unto what end? We don't know why. And absent the end, absent a knowledge of the purpose in life, life becomes precisely pointless. And then does it surprise you that as people become convinced, or as their fancies become rather seriously tickled by the idea that their lives are not going anywhere, that we have an increase in suicides, especially, and this is perhaps the most striking feature of this, especially in young people, especially in people say 13 to 26 or so. The very people whom in previous generations we would have thought are the most hopeful of all people in the world because they have their lives to look forward to. And these are the people who are more and more committing suicide. This leaves, in Alan Tate's expression, this leaves many people in our time orphans. Orphans from tradition, orphans from the real, orphans from their social associations, and trying to live unto no end. And this is all to say, with Walker Percy, that to be a typical person of the 21st century is to be lost in the cosmos. That is pretty much the statistically normal human condition today. So all is not well, and that's a dismal diagnosis. But there's good news. All is not lost. For those to hear, there is good news, but we have to go to the past to find it. And that, I think, when y'all first proposed this idea or told me about this idea, is the great promise of this series, is to offer for free a therapy to correspond to the diagnosis. So now I want to move to the second part of my few remarks this afternoon. Howsoever clumsily, I want to offer a little bit of a preview about St. Thomas and suggest some of the reasons that explain why he's a great thinker and why he is the preeminent great thinker for our times, perhaps more than ever. There are three elements to this as I see it, or as I care to divide it out. There are many ways you could do this. First, there is the very depth and breadth of his thinking. Remember, contrast against Postman. A comprehensive, metaphysical, and religious understanding of the real is absent. So what is therapeutic for that has to have both depth and breadth. Second, it has to be coherent, and that coherence will manifest itself in organization. The Zumma Theologiae, which y'all have chosen, is one of the most brilliantly organized documents that anybody has ever written. And finally, the nature of ourselves, human nature, the nature of the subject. What is it about us as human that is addressed by this cure? Why does the therapy work for this patient? This patient meaning any one of us. So first, the breadth of St. Thomas's thought. The very object of Thomas's thought is absolutely, that is to say, unqualifiedly universal. When you say that the object of metaphysics is being itself, there is quite literally, it's almost comical to say, there is literally nothing left out. Every once in a while, I will get a paper from an undergraduate student who is trying very, very hard to sound very, very philosophical, but is perhaps not doing such a good job at thinking, who makes a remark like this: what we are dealing with is beyond being. And I always write into the margin, what would that be that is beyond being? Question mark, question mark. When you are addressing being, you are unqualifiedly addressing everything. And this is why Thomas's thought is therapeutic for people who have no comprehensive thought. Thomas addresses quite exactly everything that exists. He addresses what is. Late Father Schall, used that expression consistently through his writings when he's talking about metaphysics. And he very frequently would put it in italics. This philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, St. Thomas, addresses what is the real, the scope, the breadth of metaphysics. Moreover, St. Thomas addresses the reality according to that which is common to all things. What all things have in common, no matter their differences, is that they are. And we will see, I'm sure, as we go along, how Thomas sees the reconciliation. He sees the paradoxical single truth that things are multiple and yet they are unified. And so he does not have to squeeze out. He does not have to abandon some experiential feature of the real in the interests of his theory. He is not a man in the grip of the theory. His theory is subject to the demands of the real. And that brings me to a third characteristic of Thomas's thinking. It is precisely realistic. It aims to know what is, discovering rather than confecting, finding rather than making, confronting in honesty and truth rather than contriving something imaginary. The real is found. Learning, and especially philosophical and theological learning, are voyages of discovery. They are strands or threads in that voyage of life. Wow, where does that metaphor take us? Homer, Virgil, Dante. The intellectual component of our lives is a thread which brings us to discovery of the real. In Thomas's words, the human intellect is both contained within the universe, but is also able to contain the universe within itself. Pascal says this in a way that is less formal and less technical, but Pascal in the 17th century has the same insight when he says that by space, the universe grasps me and swallows me up like a speck, but by thought, I grasp it. And what he is giving to his literary French audience is that same teaching that we find in Thomas, that man both contains the universe within himself by knowledge and yet is contained within the universe because we are nature. In any event, the most important thing to remember here is that the human mind takes in what exists rather than contriving what is factitious. By the scope, moving to the second element of these three, by the scope of St. Thomas, I mean the layout of his presentation, how he understands the real. And my resource on this, incidentally, if you were to want to track back to a scholarly source, Marie-Dominique Chenoux, French Thomist, 20th century, lays this out in one of his books. And he published this also in an article simply called The Scope of the Summa. I'm taking scope directly, the term scope directly from the pages of Father Chenoux. St. Thomas takes his cues in a way from St. Augustine, because the structure of Augustine's thought begins with God and understands that creation is the origin, it is the act which is the origin of all things. So God is at the origin, and by the act of creation, he gives being to what is other than himself, and that the purpose of that creation is ultimately to return to him, because all of creation has the dynamic of the seeking of the good, and none more so than man, and none more dramatically, historically than man. But of course, Augustine did not imagine that he was being original. Augustine was looking at the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth, God and then creation. And what do we have at the very, very end? We have the extravagant, metaphorical, figurative, mystical language of revelation about heaven. Well, okay, so Augustine is, unsurprisingly, Augustine has chosen the absolutely most authoritative source for the structure of the scope of his thinking. But then in Thomas, we see also not only the reference to Augustine, who is, I believe, the second most cited source in Augustine, in Thomas, along with Aristotle. I forget 1 and 2. One is cited more than the other. The Bible, Aristotle, and Augustine are the most commonly cited sources in Thomas. But in any event, be that as it may, what the Bible simply does is to tell the truth about the origin of all things. And when very, very soon in an upcoming episode, there will be a discussion of proving the existence of God, we will prove by reason alone that we have to start our understanding of reality with that absolutely unqualifiedly first principle, who is God. So because it's real, because the Bible, because Augustine, therefore in St. Thomas we find this coming out and returning structure of creation, that is, what is created, from and to God. And this is usually referred to as an exit and return, exitus reditus scheme. Now, obviously, that plan or schema needs a great deal of exposition and explanation, but it is nevertheless always an exit and return structure found in what is real. I want to take a moment here to notice something important. Point, not be surprised to see that the universe is coherent. And here's why it is not surprising at this very point in our very first moments, in our very first minutes, in our very first time together. Those things which emerge from the same cause are thereby and therefore related to one another. And those things which aim at the same final purpose are therefore and thereby coordinated among themselves. This characteristic of the universe, which Neil Postman remarks is utterly lacking in people's understanding today, this coherence, this is built into the real, and it is manifest in St. Thomas's teaching. And I don't think anyone says this quite as tidily, quite as, with quite the compression, the density, interestingly, as Plato. Plato refers in the Timaeus to the universe as, quote, an ordered whole that has its foundation in a transcendent cause, understood as most perfect and most essentially generous. It shouldn't really be surprising to us that Plato notices something which St. Thomas also notices. They are, after all, looking at the same world, and that they each have a recognition explicitly of this coordinated complexity by which the real is coherent. The universe, there's a name for this. The universe is, in Thomas's thought, in Plato's thought, in Aristotle's thought, in Augustine's thought, in almost all of pre-modern thought, the universe is symbolical. And what symbolical means is that every part is related to every other part. Okay? This is manifestly lacking in the world that Postman describes. Now I want to move to some final remarks about the human mind. Why is it that the human mind, with its present pathology, needs or is such that it needs this therapy? One of the odd problems that seems to be universal in man is that we aspire to too little. Over 70 years ago, C.S. Lewis made these remarks. He was speaking at Cambridge during the Second World War. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies and imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. It is common to settle for too low. Intellectual aspirations, as life aspirations in general, need to be geared for us in order to speak to us. They need to be geared to the potential greatness that is written in us. It's been attributed many times and under different circumstances, but the observation is always true. This has been attributed a bunch to Benedict XVI. We are not born for comfort. We are born for greatness. I mean, in that context, you can see what Lewis is saying. You know, most people are quite comfortable at a certain point, and they don't want to aspire to greatness. And partly because, of course, greatness, that kind of achievement comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of discipline. It isn't easy. Nevertheless, both in mind and heart, man is designed to learn, to understand, to be wise, and to live wisely. That hunger for truth and goodness is inexhaustible in us. And this is why, again, Pascal says that there is in the human heart an infinite abyss of desire for goodness. And Thomas would probably want to add over his shoulder, don't forget that the reason of that is that there is in the human mind an infinite abyss of desire for knowledge of what is true. It is built into what is decisively and definitively human, to be unsatisfied with where we are and to be drawn and propelled to always better and more. Never too proud to take a page from Aristotle, Thomas reaffirms that the human mind is, in a way, all things. Wow. Quodammodo omnia, in some way, all things. That describes, in very, very simple terms, the hunger and the capacity of the human mind. Not certainly to know all things perfectly, but even to come to the fringe, the edge of mystery, where knowledge fails, but love can proceed even in a way beyond knowledge. So knowing what is true, and therefore knowing the truth about goodness, the human intellect both receives and commands both receives truth and commands according to truth, that we do what is good in the carrying out of a course of a happy life. And this expression, happy life, is the objective, the goal, the point, the purpose of the therapy. And so what we hope to be able to do, or what this series, I suspect, hopes to be able to do, is to have this intellectually therapeutic efficacy. Okay, so this is just a very few remarks about St. Thomas. And I think maybe you're going to put up a little bibliography of some things that people can read that are of an introductory nature. And maybe later on, people will even want to read things of a more scholarly nature, although I kind of think the best stuff is written for the widest audience. Anyway, okay, very good. So those will suffice for my introductory remarks. I think there were some questions.
Yeah, I mean, really, you kind of talked about this idea of the needs of the modern man, and I think the environment in which these needs are most kind of, the human mind is most open to encountering these truths is the university. So if you could touch on, or maybe explain, kind of move your prescription from kind of like generally to maybe like, what do we need in the modern university that Aquinas offers?
That's a terrifically important question. I gotta tell you, I'm gonna tell you something I just happened to have read at random yesterday, or maybe it was even this morning. Universities today in America and throughout the world, Western Europe, are in a shambles. Higher education, this is not to say that this isn't true beyond higher education, but higher education is very often a charade. It's been taken over by postmodernism and by political agendas and by the demands of what you might want to call special interest groups and so on. the contrast is this. I just read this this morning. You may be familiar with it's a enterprise, it's a company and they sell something called the Great Courses. And I don't know what they cost, but for a modest amount of money, you can buy a course in Shakespeare, or you could buy a course on Goethe, or you could buy a course on Plato, or a course on the Old Testament, or a course on Roman history, so on, so on, so on. And the contrast between the very, very successful enterprise of selling people the great courses, which the universities, is that the Great Courses Company sells almost no lectures that are akin to those actually given in universities, because people won't pay for that. And they're interested in making money. Well, how do you make money? You can make money by offering people a course in music history. Wow, I want to know about that. I've heard some Bach, I've heard some Mozart. Fill me in, tell me more. People are craved to understand this. Tell me about the Renaissance. The Renaissance is so cool. I want to go to Italy. I want to see, I want to go to Rome. I want to go to Florence. I want to ride a gondola in Venice. Tell me about all of this. They want to know this stuff. They want to know about Aristotle. They want to know about Plato. They want to know about Virgil and Homer. They don't want to know about gender theory. They don't. They don't want to know about the history of neo-Stalinism. It doesn't. What doesn't it do? It doesn't appeal to the native desire of commonsensical people for what is true, good, and beautiful. And everything that I named has an appeal, and has appealed for centuries and centuries and centuries in this way. So I'm not sure, going back to your questions, I'm not sure that the universities can at present be reformed unless they are completely rebuilt. There are a few schools, incidentally, which are persistently classic and classical in their operations. For instance, Thomas Aquinas College, which just recently doubled in size by opening a second campus I think it's in New England. They began in California, and they began in a rebellion of a number of faculty members from a different university, which was drifting off in this other direction. That was back in the early 70s. Well, okay, so one thing, I have no prescription for fixing the university, except to say you have to return to doing what you're supposed to be doing. And you have to drop the charade, and you have to get serious, and you cannot have this present more of the same, because it's a failing formula. I suppose even economically, maybe it's a failing formula. I don't know. Anyway. So there's that. Some reflections. Compare the great courses to what's offered at a local state or private university, for that matter. I would name names, but maybe we're not supposed to name names.
Yeah, I think in general, I'm always so shocked at the modern conception of the liberal arts as just kind of like time wasters, as impractical, for the very modern idea of specificity, of ultra specificity, of conviction. I mean, to that, and
even distortion too. I'm told, one of my colleagues tells me it's not uncommon in lots of places, for instance, to teach courses on Shakespeare the Marxist, Shakespeare as feminist, deconstructing Shakespeare. Huh? And the great courses allow you to understand what is Shakespeare doing in the tragedies and the histories.
Right, yeah, right. The general stuff. I think it's important to kind of like to understand that, kind of use an analogy of that film Karate Kid, right? Like you have the whole wax on, wax off, and at its heart, you can't really see the practical, specific application. But I mean, it's such a fundamental foundation for, the essentials of karate, right?
I love that scene in that movie for that reason.
Right.
And it's true, but you can't, and it is precisely true. It's a wonderful representation. Now, you can't expect the kid to understand what's going on, but his discipline, his obedience, and admittedly his frustration are going to pay off, and they do pay off. And we, as the audience, get to see that.
Right.
Yeah. So my question pertains a little more to, you have this list of what Aquinas uses in this in the Summa, and you list, of course, Augustine's in there. He uses the Bible a lot, and some people may ask, why does Aristotle get a reference in Aquinas's work? From an outsider view, it seems you're using these very Christian sources, but then why throw in Aquinas and why throw in Aristotle, and what is his what is that relation to truth?
Well, one of the things that's going on, one of the reasons of that is an historical consideration, which is that the works of Aristotle during St. Thomas's lifetime were for the first time in hundreds and hundreds of years, becoming available in the Latin-speaking western part of Europe. Of course, Aristotle wrote in Greek, and Aristotle's works did not get translated into Latin. Boethius had it in mind in the 6th century, but he never managed to accomplish that for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that he was executed. But in any event, so let's just say that in the beginning of the 6th century, Boethius had not, in fact, been able to translate Aristotle from Greek into Latin. Greek fell into disuse, and the western part of Europe fell into ignorance of Greek, with the exception of Irish monks. Okay, and this is why Cahill wrote that book some years ago called "How the Irish Saved Civilization," and he certainly had a point there. Okay, but the works of Aristotle were known in the East, and they were known in Syria. They began to filter through the Levant, through North Africa, and so on, and came back into contact in the Western world through Spain, just around the time of Thomas's young life. And he became acquainted with them. He had a translator who worked for him, William of Merbeke, Dutchman. And William of Merbeke is regarded historically as one of the finest translators who ever lived, because he was able to take Aristotle's Greek and render it accurately in terms of its meaning into Latin. So St. Thomas, who did not know Greek, was able to make contact with Aristotle, and he wasn't the only one. His teacher, Albert the Great, whom I mentioned, was also doing this, and a number of others. Historians of thought will refer to this as the Aristotelian Revolution. But in any event, everybody in the university world in Thomas's time was discovering Aristotle and trying to figure out, what do we do with this? Because some of them found Aristotle to be pagan and alien, and others found him to be insightful and helpful. And Thomas is of the latter kind, as was Albert the Great. Bonaventure, not so much, okay? And the Franciscans generally, Duns Scotus, for example, again. But in what's going on here is that St. Thomas has this source in Aristotle, and there is a very, very lively question. What are we supposed to make of this? Is it good? Is it bad? Do we keep some, throw some away? Can we buy into it wholesale, or is it just wrong and false and evil and alien? What do we do? And Thomas is able to discover the insight that is shot through Aristotle, and to import it and to make it his own, and consistently even to improve upon it. So he is probably, in his own estimation, standing on the shoulders of a giant, just as he is standing on the shoulders of giants when he writes his commentaries on sacred scripture. But it's sort of an historical oddity. And you're identifying that, wait a minute, we've got this pagan Greek. What's going on here? And of course, Plato was unknown, almost entirely unknown in the 13th century. The Platonic documents don't come back to Western Europe until, I think, about the 15th century in the Council of Florence.
So I guess that leads to our next question. So in terms of our current crisis, COVID-19, what would you highlight as a few lessons that St. Thomas Aquinas would probably impart to us during this time?
In one short phrase, the cross comes before the crown. Suffering, which is intrusive into every single human life. That's an important point. I don't know of anyone who's ever tried to prove that, but if you try to deny that, you're on a fool's errand. Everyone's life involves hardship. Now, the great question, the problem about human suffering lies in asking whether or not it is meaningful. Is it intelligible? And the answer to that, if we shave it down, if we condense and distill it, is that of itself, suffering is not meaningful. You go visit your friend in the hospital who is terribly ill and in great pain with some kind of disease or something medically wrong. And as you confront your friend there in that hospital bed, that moment is not of itself intelligible. It is just awful. However, that implies that it is either subject to an infusion of intelligibility from something beyond it, or it is simply unintelligible. Well, the Passion and Resurrection, to say the cross comes before the crown, using C.S. Lewis's expression, is to say that all hardship of whatever kind, whether it is a mass hardship or whether it is just you having something very, very difficult in your life, physically, psychologically, intellectually, whatever it may be, morally, these difficulties become meaningful because we are confident, we know that there is somehow a principle by which they are suffused with meaning. The universe is a plenum of intelligibility. And the reason of that, philosophically, is that being itself is intelligible. That does not imply that it is intelligible to us, or to us perfectly, or to us all the time. So there's a story that I've heard people tell a number of times that I think is very illustrative. I'll never forget the first time I heard this. It was quite a number of years ago. And I was talking to a comparatively young man, I guess maybe in his 30s or so. And he was telling a little bit about his life, and it emerged that he had been a drug addict, actually an alcoholic. And the thing that he said that lodged in my mind these decades later, is still lodged in my mind these decades later, was I needed to be an alcoholic. And I'm thinking, huh? It's a horrible place to be in your life. That's dreadful. That's deadly. That has horrifying effects not only on you, but on everybody around you. How can you possibly say that you needed that? But from his perspective, he says, well, because this is what happened. I thought I knew everything. And the spine of my pride had to be broken in pain before I could learn the humility to make progress in life. And I'm thinking, oh, golly, I'm reminded of the story about Bernard of Clairvaux being asked, what are the cardinal virtues? Humility, 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 and humility. It's the starting point. So my point in telling this story is simply to say that, yes, it was a horrifying, I'm sure it was a horrible time in this life, in this guy's life. But it was the only way for him that he could proceed beyond that. Was it meaningful? Yeah. Did it seem that way at the time? No. Is that emblematic of all hardship, of all suffering, of all pain? Yes. And so of this. And I suppose, if we were to ask if I put this, say, for instance, in terms of, I'm just trying to organize and think about generations here, and I don't know how our hours correspond, but if I put this in terms of, say, my parents' generation, probably by somewhere later in their lives, my parents would have said that they learned a great deal from growing up in the Great Depression and from having been married during the Second World War, when my dad was drafted into the Army, and when my mom had two little girls and her husband's gone. She had her parents and her in-laws and all of that. Of course, this is a slightly different era, but nevertheless, imagine a 22, 23-year-old with two infant daughters whose husband has been taken away by a war from which he may not return, when dairy products are rationed, when meat is rationed, when people are being told to grow vegetables in their backyards so that they will have enough to eat. I suspect it was a very difficult time for my mom. And yet I am confident that later on, she and my dad were quite grateful that they had learned some important lessons about sorting out what was and what wasn't important, and what to teach their children as well. So, same thing. Does it make sense at the time? Is it hard at the time? Is it painful at the time? Does it seem meaningless at the time? Yeah. But you don't want to make the logic mistake of saying, I don't understand it, therefore it doesn't make any sense. It's an astonishingly arrogant thing to say. So once again, we're back to the lesson of humility. Just a few random comments apropos of that. Yeah, for your generation, even for mine, I belong to the post-war generation, our generations have known nothing but prosperity in 60, 70 plus years. And so to be struck by something which doesn't, for many people, it's just obviously very, very different from different people, is not all that difficult, okay? For some people, it is enormously difficult. If you lost your job, if you're having trouble putting food on the table, if you genuinely are at becoming ill, if you have some problem maybe about age or a medical circumstance, the difficulty is much, much greater. So I can only speak for myself and say that it isn't that hard. Yeah, I would like to go out to dinner. I would like to see y'all face to face, but okay, it isn't that hard. But where we are, nevertheless, is a hardship, and its meaning cannot be found within itself. So we need hope and sound philosophical thinking, and even more importantly, sound theological reflection on religious truth is the source by which we come into contact with that hope.
Thank you for that. And then I guess this leads to my final question, and just to wrap the show up. So for the average college student today, what would you say to them as to why St. Thomas's thought really matters? In a society where many claim that God is dead, how could the study of Aquinas be beneficial, even to someone who does not yet ascribe to the Christian faith?
Study of philosophy, as also incidentally study of literature and art, are studies of what are sometimes called the permanent things. Truth, goodness, and beauty encapsulate in 3 words the permanent things. To know the truth, to desire and love the beautiful, to appreciate that which is beautiful. These are objectives now listen to me carefully, those are objectives in human life. One of the best ways in which the permanent things, goodness, truth, beauty, and questions about these and learning about these, even the easiest ways and one of the most powerful ways to identify what the permanent things are is to point out that they are the things without which our lives would be reduced to the level of the lives of beasts. If we did not have a love for what is good, a hunger to know what is true, and a capacity to be fulfilled and to enjoy by the appreciation of what is beautiful, then we would be farm and forest animals. So, and to be geared to these things is indispensable to living a human life. Now, I realize that, as Alexander Pope says in the Essay on Man, we are able to abdicate our own humanity, and that strange ability that we have by free will to abdicate our humanity is what makes us glory, jest, and riddle of the world. But nevertheless, the offer is there. The offer is there to live a human life. And in order to do that, there has to be an encounter between persons and what is permanently true, good, and beautiful. And the reason that these things are called permanently good is that in every place and time, these are common objects of human zeal. You know, it's interesting to go back to ancient Greece. Well, the ancient Greeks, even though they stand in a very important relationship to us in an historical continuity, they spoke a different language. They lived in a different time. They belonged to a different culture. But what did they do? Epic poetry, tragic and comic drama. There's something about the Olympic Games that is aesthetic. They gave the art, I'm thinking particularly of architecture, that is still, maybe not so much since Bauhaus and all of that, which is still recognizable in its beauty today. You go to Nashville and you can see the Parthenon. It's astonishing, and it's still beautiful. So the permanent things are permanent because they are common to everyone who is human, whether ancient Greek or whether 21st century American. But our problem is that we're losing touch. We're fleeing reality. And so the value of studying St. Thomas is, at the very, very least, to give a little credit to the possibility that, as Chesterton says, we should be real Democrats. We should not disenfranchise people any more than we would by an accident of birth, wealth or poverty, one race or another. We should not disfranchise anyone because of the accident of death. And just because Aristotle, St. Thomas, and St. Augustine are dead does not preclude them from having contributions to make to us. To write them off is simply irrational and peremptory. Free to do that, but at great cost.